working from the Gospel of John, chapter 18 and 19, we want to work with the trials of Jesus as he moves toward the crucifixion. There's a great deal more ground, in fact, in terms of his trials, more verses written to cover that than there are the crucifixion and his death. The events that we'll be looking at in John chapter 18 specifically have to do with God's interaction with Peter, bringing him to a place that he's never been before in his lifetime. And also, surprisingly enough, into another man's life, Pontius Pilate. Reading out of John chapter 18. Jesus has spoken words to his disciples. They've crossed the Kidron Valley. They've gone to the Garden of Gethsemane. And now comes their rest, where Jesus says, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus says to them, I am he. And in the Greek, it's really ego eimi, I am. Autu, the word he is not there. I am. And Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them, and Jesus said to them, I am. And they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am. So if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? We'll come to that event in the next few minutes as Peter goes into the high priest's courtyard. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And first they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Every time John, the writer of the gospel, mentions himself, he never uses his name. He always says another disciple, or perhaps the disciple whom Jesus loved. In this case, of course, he is the other disciple. And since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door, and so the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out, spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. And the servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also, you're not one of these disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. And the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. And they were standing and warming themselves. And Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The event of Peter in the courtyard, fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus that he would deny him 3 times, is interrupted here by the high priest questioning Jesus and Jesus' answers to him. And then finally, we pick up this again, Peter standing and warming himself in verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and so they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Of course he remembered him because Malchus had been so hurt by Peter's sword. In another gospel account, of course, Jesus says enough of this and reaches down and touches Malchus's ear, and it is healed. And in this supernatural moment of having come from the garden and in trial before Annas and perhaps as well other members of the Sanhedrin Council who were in favor of killing Jesus, Peter is faced with denials. The 7 I ams, and there are more than that, but the famous 7 I ams of the Gospel of John, where Jesus portrayed that he was, as the Lord had said to Moses in Exodus 3, what's your name? And he says, I am that I am. That same I am character is in Jesus, of course, and His character is being displayed in the 7 I ams. You probably know some of those, of course. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the true vine. And so those I ams, immediately upon Peter's rehearsing whether he knows Jesus or not, we come to the famous, I am not. Peter's denials of Jesus, prophesied out of John 13, verses 36 through 38 by Jesus. And in this courtyard of the high priest, we find Peter standing and warming himself with the soldiers who arrested Jesus in John 18, verse 18. And so, at the third denial, the rooster crows. It's interesting the events that the Spirit of God uses in our lives to bring us to a place of reality when sometimes we don't have any hope of being in the truth. So the rooster crows. Mark 14 says the rooster crows twice, which is sort of characteristic of roosters as I recall in early mornings. But nonetheless, the event is not how many times the rooster crowed, it's the fact that it happened. Prophesies, of course. This is when Peter will know he has denied the Lord, not once or twice, but 3 times. God uses natural means often to awaken us to spiritual realities. Natural means. I encounter that a lot with people who are in the hospital. And there's perhaps an event that has taken place, not only in their life, but in their family's life. And they're fearful. They're struggling. Suddenly, how you use your Sundays takes a lot of importance. Suddenly, how you use whether you're in a church or not is a lot of importance. Suddenly, people want a pastor to come and talk to them when most days that would not be what they were looking forward to. But you know how it is with medical health, medical strength, medical surgeries. Sometimes when doctors say to us the things we never want to hear, suddenly, you know, the day-by-day work of this world doesn't amount to anything. We need something from God. We become people who need the Lord to stand by us, or we need to know Him, and the realities of eternity are before us. So a rooster crows, natural means as it is, and awakens Peter to the event that's going to require his repentance. I'm glad, at least, that we can say, because we know what the rest of the Scriptures say about Peter, as he went out and wept bitterly and repented. And later Jesus would deal with him again about these 3 denials. Now, how the Spirit of God works with us is an unusual event. He never throws us away. He never throws us away. He never discards us. He never acts like the sin that we have done or the embarrassment that we have put him to. He never acts like, oh, that's the end of the road. You're going to have to go your way now because I'm really offended. No, that's kind of how people take it, but that's not how the Spirit of God handles things. He just talks to us about Jesus. That's what the Lord said He would do in John 16. He just rehearses for us one more time how Christ loves us, how the Father has a place for us in eternity with Him, how there's a room furnished for us in eternity, and how we'll be with Him forever, and how the book of Revelation says to us, the tears will all be wiped away, and we'll be singing. There won't be a single person in heaven, along with you and me, who isn't there because of Christ's cross. There isn't a single one there who got there because they deserve it. All of us have been people who have denied the Lord in some fashion or other. Not perhaps before the high priest of Israel, Not maybe as we've dealt with Pontius Pilate, but all of us, have had a place and time in our lives when we needed desperately the Lord's forgiveness. Where we needed the Spirit of God to come and talk to us and bring us through terrible times, hard times, sinful times, discouraging places, places where we wish we had never been at all, nor ever want to be again. But the Spirit of God comes to us and in so many natural ways speaks to us of supernatural blessings and forgiveness. In Peter's case, it's a rooster. There have probably been a number of roosters in that sense who have crowed for you. Places where you have needed to say, I am sorry, Lord. I need your help here. I am not who I thought I was. I don't have the courage that I thought I had. I do not know what to do next. I am frustrated beyond belief. The faith I thought I had has deserted me in the midst of this trial. I know we can identify with Peter. There's somebody else involved in this story of the trials of Jesus, and that has to do, of course, with Pontius Pilate, as I say. And so in John chapter 18, verse 28, they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. That's the palace where he was. It was early morning, and they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered him, If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. The Jews said to him, It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. There's the plan. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Because back in John chapter 12, he says to them, When I am lifted up, I will draw all men to me. And the crowd there knew exactly the phrase he was using to describe crucifixion. It might go over our head when we're reading that passage because we haven't seen a man crucified by the state as a criminal, but they had seen it often. They knew what being lifted up was all about. As Deuteronomy says, Cursed is the man who's hung on a tree, who dies on the tree. And so they understood what he was saying, and they questioned him. What do you mean? We thought the Messiah would live forever. The Christ is here forever. What do you mean you're going to die? They understood exactly what he was saying. But that's what Jesus was saying to them. It's the cross. I'm headed for the cross. So Pilate enters his headquarters in verse 33 and calls Jesus and says to them, Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Now you may wonder why parry with Pontius Pilate. Why did he bother to ask the question? Well, he's going someplace. Keep following. And Pilate answers, of course, Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest have delivered you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom, he says again 3 times in this verse, but my kingdom is not from the world. A couple of things I need to say to you about this. Pilate could find no crime in this person. Nothing deserving his judgment. Nothing deserving the cross. Nothing deserving prison. But he tries 3 times, as you look at John chapter 18 and 19, to release Jesus from this Roman judgment. He could find no crime in him. And as you look at the passages, you will see that often. What have you done? And finally in John 18:38, Pilate says to him, after he had said this, he went back outside the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. He was not successful, of course. The main reason, of course, being because although the Jews had a terrible plan of death, and Pilate could deliver that death as the Roman governor, it was really the plan of God, you see. Of course, you know, Acts chapter 4 says to us that the Lord's plan was predestined. That though Herod was against him and Pilate was against him, nonetheless, and the Jews, the religious leaders of the Jews were against him, nonetheless, God's plan was to use their evil intentions to accomplish something wonderful in this world. God's plan of redemption for us, you and me, and all of us who are sitting here, and all of us who ought to be sitting here. There's a plan. There's a plan. It centers around Jesus' willingness to go to the cross, of course. But Pilate could find no crime. And when Jesus talks about the reality of the spiritual life, Pilate doesn't know much about the reality of the spiritual life, you understand? He's a hard-bitten officer of the law, a servant of Caesar. And he got into this position as a governor in Judea for some 10 years. I believe the years that he served there were 25 to 35 AD. And in that period of time, I'm sure he was famous for employing whatever bloodshed was needed to enforce his law. This is a hard man, hard-nosed, hard-headed. But when Jesus starts to talk about my kingdom, my kingdom, my kingdom, Pilate answers then in verse 37, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. It's the most remarkable thing that in Pilate's relationship in these brief minutes with Jesus, he not only could not find any crime as Jesus' judge, he could not find the kingdom. The kingdom. But you can tell as you read this passage, he began to think there was one. He began to believe there was something about this man far greater than he knew. Back in Matthew chapter 27, it says, while Pilate is on the judgment seat, his wife sends him word, do not do anything about this righteous man. I have suffered a great deal about him in a dream. The same Spirit of God that brings the truth to Peter by a rooster's crow brings the truth to Pilate by his wife. Brings the truth to Pilate by him standing there and looking in the Palestinian Jewish brown eyes of Jesus. And so Jesus throws out this lifeline. It's the most amazing thing to me. The man who was going to order his crucifixion, Jesus Christ throws out to him a lifeline. A way of escaping the eternity that is before him. Pilate could not find a crime and he couldn't find the kingdom, but I think he begins to suspect that Jesus may well be a king. Someone beyond himself. Someone he has never met before. The reality of which, as he questions Jesus, he begins to see. And Jesus' lifeline to him is, listen to this in verse 37. I've come to bear witness to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth, what do? Jesus says, everyone who's of the truth listens to my voice. It was a door opening. Like he said to his own disciples, come and follow me. But here's the conditions, the three imperatives of Mark chapter 8. If any man would follow after me, he must. It's an imperative in the Greek tense, used 3 times in a row. He must deny himself. He must take up his cross. And thirdly, he must follow after me. It's not in your English text, but it's outstanding in the Greek. 3 imperatives. He must, he must, he must. The door was open, and Pilate closes it when he says in verse 38, what is truth? Everyone who's of the truth listens to my voice, Jesus says, and Pilate answers, so what is truth? After he had said this, he went back outside of the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas was a robber. So Pilate took Jesus, John 19, verse 1, flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. And they came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. And Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold, the man. And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! And Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. But the Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he's made himself the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. So he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? And Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered him, You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. And therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews kept crying, If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, named Gabbatha in the Hebrew. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He says to the Jews, Behold your king. And they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. You might remember that Pilate wrote a sign, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And though the Jews read this inscription, because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic and in Latin and in Greek, so the chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. Jesus gives away. Jesus throws out a lifeline. You can see it in a rooster crows in Peter's life. Brings him to the end of himself. You can see it as Jesus shares with Pilate, of all people, I am the truth. And everybody who wants the truth in their life listens to my voice. And Pilate shut the door. But impressed nonetheless. Because every time you turn around in this passage, Pilate is calling him a king. No, not because of his own personal faith in this man. No. And maybe even throwing it at the Jewish leaders who he royally hated. But the fact that he would even use the word of a Jew who was standing before him in trial means that He was moved. And I believe it is a work of the Holy Spirit to move us beyond ourselves, to correct our sinfully conniving, hard-nosed ways, to bring us to the end of our own wisdom and bring us to this place where the Christ who gave Himself on the cross has every right to be in charge of our lives. Maybe that's true of you. Maybe that's true. I sure hope it is, but if it's a doubt in your life, you know, this service today, wherever you are in your own spiritual life, this service today could be the rooster crowing. It could be a confrontation. It could be light in a dark room for you. It could be a calling you from wherever it is you have lived and whatever else you have done into the light of Christ, to bring you to a place where you no longer are in a denial, where you no longer are a door shutter, as Pilate was to the truth of Jesus, where you begin to open up the door of your life and your mind to allow the Spirit of God to make real to you the Jesus who died on the cross for us all. I invite you to turn to Him now, to just simply come to Him with this understanding. You have given me a way of life, and I want it. I want it. I'm receiving it. Lord, forgive me. Come take charge in my life. I give it up to you. Amen.